Roman statesman and philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero once said, "Memory is the treasury and guardian of all things."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I chat with memory expert Chase DiMarco. This episode centers around a recent conversation I had with Chase DiMarco, who's a memory expert who tries to help folks remember large amounts of information and reliably retrieve it later when they need it. Chase DiMarco is the founder of Free Med Ed and author of the book Read This Before Medical School, which I discussed in the preview episode's book club segment. He's also the host for the Medical Mnemonist podcast and the 1 Minute Preceptor podcast. He's an education entrepreneur with an MBA, and he's also an MD PhD candidate. So clearly, he's a busy guy, and I'm really grateful he's here to speak with us. A lot of Chase's work focuses on medical studies. That is, the problems medical students face in studying, working, and, well, just living life during medical school and residency. But in reading and listening to him, especially in the Medical Mnemonist podcast, I find that what he and his colleagues have to offer can also be spot on for helping A&P students learn all the terminology, facts, concepts, and themes that they need to master to be successful, or even to just survive. The bonus being that they'll be ready with the skills they need for medical school or nursing school or their PT program or wherever they're headed after we get done with them. Clearly, we can't cover everything in just one episode. So for now, we're going to chat about a particular method that some of your students may find useful. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association for Anatomy. You can find them at anatomy.org or with the Twitter handle @anatomyorg. And I want to make a toast to my friend Dee Silverthorn, who was recently inducted as a Fellow of the American Association for Anatomy, recognizing her demonstrated excellence in and contributions to the anatomical sciences. She certainly deserves this honor. Long ago, when a small group of us were establishing the professional development program called HAPS Institute, in partnership with AAA and other organizations, Dee stepped up for us in a big way by designing and teaching our first 2 graduate courses. I sat in on parts of both courses, and I was blown away by her deep preparation of the courses, her friendly yet expert demeanor, and, well, mostly by how much fun I and the learners had as she helped us stretch beyond what we already knew or thought we knew. So, congratulations, Dee. All right, well, Chase, I'm really glad that you're here with us on our podcast. And we've been talking a lot about study skills and how we can help students with study skills. And I know that's something that you're really very interested in. So what is it you do with study skills? What brought you to this topic and what kind of work do you do in it?
Well, first, thanks, Kevin, for having me on the show. It's great to be able to speak to your audience and really get out some of the information, some of these skills that I've been studying for the past couple of years now. In brief, I struggled a lot in medical school, and so did a lot of students around me. And I found that even in this type of extensive advanced graduate program, we really don't have a lot of the good information behind skills. We're not taught learning skills or study skills. It's just sort of expected that we know these already. So I started exploring these a little bit more. For the audience, I'm currently a 4th year MD student. I've actually been taking the last year off to to work on some of these side projects, such as a book and podcast, so I can really get this information out to individuals, to students and instructors better. But I also have a master's in educational psychology. So I use this information sort of coming at it from two approaches, from the educational psychology and cognitive psychology aspects, but also from my experiences in med school, and really found that there are a couple of simple techniques that students can use and don't know about, and some more advanced ones that, such as the mnemonics that we'll probably be talking about later, that a lot of people hear about them and say, oh, that's really cool, but have absolutely no idea how to implement them in their current studies. So that kind of is a summary of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, that's kind of the direction we've been going in on our podcast. And that is, this idea of students coming into our class, being overwhelmed, not really knowing what to do to not only succeed, but even just to survive in the course. So what I'm hearing from you is that that's a pretty typical experience, I guess, for students.
It really is. And something that's been frequently mentioned on a lot of the podcasts that I've done, a lot of the guests I've had on my shows. I have the Medical Mnemonist, but I have another one called the 1 Minute Preceptor that really just focuses on interviewing physicians and educators. And they all say the same thing, is that students come into this unprepared. It's expected that they know this material or they know these skills, and they really don't. And so once you reach the level where maybe you made it through most of your undergrad without too much struggle, as I did, so you didn't really need to develop these skills. You just figured the same tactics would work later on. And you get to something more advanced, such as medical school, and realize, well, the old tactics aren't really working that well anymore. It's too much information, too quick, and you need to adapt, but you don't know where to go.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the experience of a lot of students coming into an anatomy and physiology course, because it's very early in their undergraduate career, and they really haven't had a lot of college or maybe any college courses before this that really have tested their limits in terms of being able to study and being able to remember a lot of information in a short period of time. And of course, our focus is on getting to that deeper learning, making connections and so on. And sometimes we forget about the fact that you have to learn the information first before you can start to make connections, and that many of these study techniques really do have built-in mechanisms for getting them to that next deeper level of making connections and so on. But what I want to focus on now, in previous episodes of our podcast, we've talked about some of the more well-known study techniques that students can use, such as flashcards and concept maps and a few things like that. But there's one technique that I'm familiar with in the sense that I've heard of it before. So I have familiarity, but I don't have mastery because I've never really used it, not in any planned out way. But I've heard a lot of students that do use it. And I know that a lot of memory experts and memory champions use this technique called a memory palace. So what in the world is a memory palace, and how would a student leverage that, use that in learning all of the many things they have to learn in anatomy and physiology?
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned the flashcards, because that spaced repetition will come back later on when we're actually using these memory palaces for long-term retention. But in summation, a memory palace is any sort of physical structure or scene that you can visualize very vividly in your own mind. This can be a building that you've gone into, and this is where a lot of people start with: their own homes, their bedrooms, maybe their schools or hospital, campus, library, restaurants they go to a lot. Any building can be a memory palace, but also it can be something external or even digital. Some people use parks that they jog through a lot, or video games they play a lot, even TV shows where they know the layout of the show very well. So basically, it's a location-based scene in which you use to store your visual aids, your visual mnemonics later on. So that's kind of the last step in the process. So let me backtrack a little bit. Because of the large amounts of information that students have to retain in a generally short amount of time, especially in certain courses such as A&P, there's a lot of terminology, there's a lot of location-based as far as the anatomy goes. There's a lot of equations you have to remember. These things can be translated into a image that is very personal to the student. It's something that they can associate with the actual topic or definition or concept, and then they can put that image in association with other images to form these networks and correlations between different topics or definitions or concepts. And then they store them in locations within a memory palace. So memory palace is also called the method of loci or loci, depending on how you pronounce it. So it means location based. And let's take an example of your bedroom, for instance, if you wanted to start off with one. In your bedroom, you can probably picture very vividly where the nightstand is, where your bed is, where the light fixtures or the ceiling fixtures are, where the doors, closets, windows are. All of these different physical attributes of the room can become smaller or micro locations in the larger room or macro location. And then you have multiple rooms or macro locations inside of your palace or house or building. So that's kind of a brief overview of how students can sort of use these locations within a place they're very familiar with to organize material. Now I can go into how to separate it out by different disciplines, like anatomy in this room versus physiology in that one, or there's also the story method, which is using interactions between the images to get concepts down better, but it's a little difficult to explain through audio format sometimes.
I'll be right back with Chase DiMarco. The free distribution of this podcast is sponsored by the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction, the HAPI degree. Check out this online graduate program at nycc.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI, or click the link in the show notes or episode page. Well, I guess a question I have is, okay, so I kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, I kind of get the idea that we choose some place in our imagination, and that is our memory palace, and we take the information that we need to learn, and we try to create like a visual image of it, and we put it in certain locations within that imaginary place, or it's not necessarily an imaginary place, but in our imagination, it's now populated with these ideas, with these concepts or facts or whatever. And that is going to help us retrieve them later because they're in a particular location. Or if we're using a more advanced technique, maybe they're interacting with other characters in that location. And that's going to help us retrieve them. So is that sort of the basic gist of what the memory palace is?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a very, very good, simple definition of it, because once you then try to retrieve the information later on, which you can do through something like a flashcard if you've drawn it out, or best yet is if you can just visualize it, if it's a place you're very familiar with, you can say, oh, what goes in this location? All right, I must be missing something. And you have that sort of natural retrieval process going on. And the visual memory and location-based memory of memory palaces is much, much stronger than a text-based memory. So it really strengthens the memory for the long term, but it works quickly. So generally takes less repetitions than something such as a flashcard might.
I see. Okay. So if a student comes to me and says, I'm overwhelmed with all of these bones and bone markings that you've given me to memorize, and I need to go into a lab test and be able to identify this long, long list of different bones and bone markings, bone features, some of the joints and so on. How or would that lend itself to a memory palace? And how would a student start to put that together if it was?
It definitely can. Any topic can be used in a memory palace. You find it very common now in medical training in some aspects, and very common in language training. Other complicated subjects that just have a lot of definitions, a lot of terminology to remember. And anatomy and physiology would be no different. So one way in which a student could use this is say, maybe I want all of the arm in this room, or maybe all of the forearm in this room, and all of the upper arm in a separate room. And you can chunk bits of information, chunk categories together by room. So that's one way to try to systematically plan it out. And there's infinite ways to set up a memory palace. There are general rules, but it's a very creative process, which means it's also very dependent on the individual. I've interviewed some memory champions like Alex Mullen, who also is a recent medical graduate, just started his residency, I believe. And he's a 3 or 4-time world champion in memory. And he does it very differently than other mnemonics trainers that I've interviewed who might do a more systematic approach. He just kind of goes in there and throws things all about because that's the way he got used to doing it through memory championships, having to be very quick on the draw and tossing a lot of information in places. Other people want more systematic setups. So they might say, all right, I'm going to make a list, maybe in a Word table or Excel, of 5 memory palaces I can use. So let's say your house, your parents' house, your grandparents' house, your couple of best friends' houses, something like that, whatever place comes to your mind. And now you can pick, I want the arms to be in this house or these 2 houses, depending on how dense you want them to be. I want the legs to be in this house. And even further, you could say, maybe I have a friend, Larry, so the legs are going to be in Larry's house. I have a friend, Ashley, the arms are going to be in Ashley's house. And you can kind of categorize them that way just to get a basic organization, a basic plan, right? And then you want to start actually making the visual aids, the visual markers. So depending on what you're trying to remember, if it's definitional, such as the names of all the muscles, then you might want to pick certain independent images for them, something that it sounds like. What would be a muscle that a lot of students have trouble with?
Pick any one. I don't know. I think some of the muscles of the limbs, I think, because they all to them look similar and they're just like right next to one another. So let's say something like, rectus femoris. I don't think they are rectus femoris. A lot of people say. I don't think that's one that would. I think that's probably one of the easier ones. But let's say vastus lateralis. Let's say that
one. All right. So you could take something like vastus lateralis, and forgive me, it's been a few years now since my anatomy class in year 1 of med school. So,
right. That's not something you use every day, right?
Yeah, I haven't had to cover these in great detail for some time now. And I didn't actually have the memory palace techniques during med school. I kind of learned it towards the end of my 3rd year, beginning of my 4th year. So unfortunately, a lot of the earlier materials, I didn't get to implement this in. So I'm kind of also learning as I'm teaching others. But vastus lateralis, we can do a few things. The first thing that comes to mind here is just sort of a play on words. So you could separate vastus into vast and us, or maybe you just want to focus on the vast part and lateralis. Can do something such as just splitting it up into lateral and then get rid of the rest of it. So now we have 2 words that's just quickly going through my head right now, and this is probably not going to make any sense to anyone right now. Give me a moment, I'll try to explain. So I have vast and lateral are the 2 words that kind of stick out in my mind. They're going to be different for each individual. You might find something that rhymes instead of just taking the actual word. If you can do that, sometimes that's much, much better. Can't think of too many things that rhyme with vast that would be object-based word. Past or something like that doesn't really work. If you can have an object, it makes it much easier. So instead, I'm going to say vast and lateral. So vast, in my mind, the first thing that comes to mind is a vast expanse in space. And then lateral, on the sides. So maybe I'm imagining this vast starscape or a galaxy, and then there's 2 things on the sides, maybe 2 spaceships, and they're shooting at each other from both sides of this galaxy. So they're on the lateral sides. And just something really quick and weird, and it's visually distinct, and it might not make any sense to you because it's a personal one to me. But if you can learn to make these yourselves, then you have these very descriptive images that you can now place somewhere for later recall. So later on, when I'm going through, let's say, my bedroom, and I've placed this galaxy with 2 spaceships fighting on either side on the dresser, for instance, now I can say, okay, I see my dresser. I see sitting on top of it is this scene of a galaxy. What does that mean? Oh, galaxy brings back vast. That's what it means to me. Why are these 2 spaceships on the sides? Why are they shooting at each? Oh, lateral. They're on both sides of it. Vastus lateralis. And so you kind of work forward and then work backwards. creating these visual markers to try to remember the terms a little bit better.
Okay. Yeah, that kind of fits in with some of the things we've been talking about in our past episodes. One of them being, that when we have really sort of goofy but personal images, that helps remember things. And the weirder it is, the easier it is to remember. The other thing that really fits in is a discussion we had about concept maps or mind maps. And that is that it really is, when a student creates their own, it's much more meaningful than when you hand them a concept map that you've done, because your concept map works the way your mind works.
Exactly.
And not the way their mind works. So I am glad to hear that you're saying that this is another one of those very creative kinds of study techniques that students can really make their own and really leverage the knowledge they already have and leverage the ways of thinking that they've already developed and not have to develop some new way of thinking necessarily in order to use this.
It is. It's very creative, which makes it very personal, which can make it a little tricky to teach at times. And this is why myself and most of the mnemonics instructors that I've interviewed in the past always recommend that you teach general guidelines and principles. You don't actually teach them which mnemonics to remember. Now, there are mnemonics companies out there. I've had Picmonic on, I've had Sketchy Medicine on, and those are very praised by students. And it makes sense because it takes a lot of time when you're developing these skills to get used to the process and to make your own creative markers and then to retrieve them later on through a flashcard or through going through your memory palace visually. So having that little boost there and getting an example can help students, but it's also that much more difficult to remember someone else's mnemonic. So you really need to make it weird, wacky, maybe even violent or sexual. Sometimes those work very well. You don't have to tell anyone what your visual mnemonic is, but make it very graphic and personal to you. And whatever pulls on your emotional heartstrings a little bit more, whatever makes you very happy or very sad or even very uncomfortable is likely to stick better than a very generic message. And unfortunately, a lot of times when we're making very generalizable visuals for others to use, then they have to be kind of generic. They're not necessarily going to sit with you. So those are some issues with trying to really teach students how to use these is you have to enforce that they make their own. You can give an example just to set them in the right direction, but then you really want them to create their own, just like with a mind map.
I'll be right back with Chase DiMarco. Marketing support for this podcast is provided by HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, promoting excellence in the teaching of human anatomy and physiology for over 30 years. Go visit HAPS at theapprofessor.org/HAPS. That's HAPS. I guess one of the things I would need to keep in mind if I'm teaching this technique or offering this technique to my students is that I need to emphasize with them that, let's say I'm sitting down with a handful of students in my office and they're asking me, how can we deal with this fire hose of information? And I'm giving them different, techniques and that. And they might say, well, concept maps, I just can't get the hang of that, or flashcards just don't do it for me, or do you have something else, And I'll say, well, what about these memory palaces? And kind of walk them through the idea of it. But I guess something I need to emphasize with them is that when they walk out of my office, they're not going to be fully prepared to do it, that it's something that they have to just keep coming back to until they get more and more comfortable with it. Would you say that's fair? Or?
I definitely think that's fair. Personally, I actually first heard about some of these mnemonic techniques before med school. Unfortunately, I just watched a few videos online and tried to learn from that. I think I could remember a couple of numbers better because I made a visual scene one time. But after about a week or two, I hit a roadblock and I didn't know where to go. So I completely cut off the practice without actually developing satisfactory technique. And I didn't use it all through med school, only revisiting it later on towards the end, because it's not something that you're going to be able to teach in one session. It's something that requires a little bit of practice every day or a couple of times a week or something along those lines. So when someone is actually taking this seriously, we often recommend they spend 10, 15 minutes a day, maybe in the morning, first thing before they get out of bed, using these mnemonics, going over their old ones, trying to create a new one or two. If they already have a flashcard deck, for instance, they can go through their flashcards, probably on their phone or iPad, and then make a mnemonic for it while they're sitting there in bed, write it down or store it mentally. I always suggest writing it down on your flashcard deck or drawing it out or having some reference point for later on, because you might not remember it the first time. So there's still spaced retrieval required in it, but it tends to be much less retrieval and much better organized when you can implement these techniques.
Well, this technique sounds great. I'm glad to have it now in my little toolbox that I can open up for my students and show them, hey, look, there's lots of different tools here. And it kind of, this idea of it taking a lot of practice kind of brings to mind something that I learned late in life. And that is that I give up too easy. I need to channel that when I'm talking to my students who, likewise, you give them a technique like, let's say, the memory palace, and really give along with that, not just the technique, but the encouragement that it's, don't give up too easy, like I would. It's, when you're a little kid and you're learning to write for the first time, or you're learning to read, or you're learning to ride a bike or catch a baseball, you keep working at it. I mean, just think about, little kids learning to walk. They don't fall over and then give up. They get right back up and they try it again and fall over and get up and fall over. And then eventually they get the hang of it. And I need to do that. I need to learn to do that as an adult, that when something is difficult for me, a new learning management system is thrown in my lap. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'll never learn this. But if I stick with it, I do. And the same thing with these memory palaces. If I can encourage my students to stick with it, then it can be a very useful technique. And there are a lot of resources out there that students can use to kind of get that hang of it and learn what to do. And that includes some of those at your website and show notes in the episode page, so that you can learn these memory techniques, and you can also point to them for your students. And they seem to be, geared toward medical students, but I've listened to a lot of them, and you know what? They apply to A&P students too. I mean, everything that they're talking about in there fits with what our students are going through. So I highly recommend it. And once again, thank you very much, Chase.
No, thank you. And yes, there's a lot of examples on the podcast and on our YouTube page that they can go and check. And feel free to email me or contact me on social media, and I can give a little more instruction possibly.
Regular listeners know this, but if you're new or just need reminding, don't forget that I always put links in the show notes and at the episode page at the approfessor.org/64 in case you want to further explore any ideas mentioned in this podcast, or if you want to visit our sponsors. For this episode, Chase DiMarco gave me a link for an example of how to build your own memory palace in a video tutorial called Memory Palaces for Medicine. There are also links to his podcast episodes on memory palaces, the story method mnemonic, and a blog post on evidence-based study strategies. You can reach Chase directly by way of email or any of the social media accounts listed in the show notes. Or you can even set up a one-on-one session with him. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions, comments, and ideas at the podcast hotline. That's 1-833-LION-DEN or 1-833-546-6336. Or send a recording or written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
The content of this episode is made from 100% recycled electrons and magnetic particles. I'm asking you for about 5 minutes of your time to fill out a survey. It's put together by a team of podcast analysts at PodTrack to see who's listening and to help figure out what's working and what's not. Have you ever had the experience of surveying your students in an online course and only a few of them respond? That's not very helpful, is it? As scientists, we know that sample size is important. So please, 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 take just a few minutes of your time to respond to the anonymous survey. Because it's your experience as an individual listener that's important to me. Okay, yes, I will give you extra credit if you fill it out. Just go to the approfessor.org/survey.